My name is Chloe Rivera. I'm in my mid-30s, a mother, a professional, and, until a few years ago, the kind of woman people tend to describe with soft words. Easygoing, low maintenance, strong but quiet. The kind of person who handles things. If you ask the people around me back then who I was, they'd probably say I was dependable, predictable, the one who kept the household running, remembered birthdays, smoothed over awkward moments, and didn't make scenes. I wasn't invisible in the dramatic sense. I was present everywhere. But I was underestimated in a more dangerous way. People assumed that because I was calm, I was passive. Because I didn't raise my voice, I didn't keep score. Because I loved deeply, I wouldn't draw lines. This story isn't about rage, it's not about revenge. And it's not about becoming someone loud or cruel to prove a point. It's about what happens when a woman who has been quietly observing decides, just once, to stop explaining herself and start protecting what matters most. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through a period of my life that changed everything. How I discovered my husband's affair, how I gathered proof piece by piece, and how that process wasn't fueled by bitterness, but by clarity, by motherhood, by the realization that my child deserved a life built on truth, not appearances. I want to be clear about something up front. There are no explosive confrontations here, no dramatic takedowns, no moment where I slam evidence on a table and watch someone crumble. What you'll hear instead is quieter than that, more deliberate. A series of small, almost unnoticeable choices that over time shifted the balance of power completely, legally, emotionally, and morally. This is a story about documentation instead of accusation, about patience instead of panic, about understanding that sometimes the safest, strongest move is not to react, but to prepare. For a long time, I believed that keeping the peace was the same thing as protecting my family. I believed that being reasonable would eventually be rewarded. What I learned, slowly, painfully, is that peace without honesty is just silence that benefits the person doing the harm. So this is my account. Not polished, not dramatized, just honest. I'm sharing it because there are people listening right now who feel that same quiet unease, the sense that something isn't right, but no one else seems to notice, and you're wondering if you're imagining it. If that's you, I want you to know this story isn't meant to tell you what to do. It's simply an invitation to look closely at what you already know, and to trust that clarity doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever been underestimated at the exact moment it mattered most? To them, I was the stable one. That's the word that came up most often when people talked about me. Friends, family, even my husband. Stable. As if I were furniture. Necessary, dependable, but not particularly interesting once you'd gotten used to me being there. I was the wife who remembered schedules without writing them down. The mother who packed lunches that never ran out of snacks. The woman who didn't interrupt, didn't push, didn't ask for much. When people said I was strong, it wasn't said with admiration. It was said with relief. Strong meant I wouldn't be a problem. At social gatherings, I was the one people spoke around, not to. Conversations flowed over me while I smiled, nodded, refilled drinks, and watched body language. I learned early that being observant made others comfortable. They mistook my listening for agreement, my silence for simplicity. My husband used to describe me as easy. He said it like a compliment. What that really meant was that I didn't challenge the narrative. I didn't question late meetings. I didn't demand explanations when plans changed. I trusted consistency because I believed consistency meant safety, especially for our child. I believed that if I was reasonable enough, patient enough, loving enough, the structure of our life would hold. People assumed I had no edge because I had no sharp tone. What they didn't see was how much I noticed. I noticed how decisions were made without me, then explained afterward as if they were favors. I noticed how my contributions were treated as default, while his were praised as sacrifices. I noticed how being agreeable slowly became an expectation rather than a choice. But I never framed these observations as grievances. I told myself stories instead. This is just how partnerships evolve. This is what maturity looks like. This is the cost of keeping things peaceful. Peace became my performance. If there was tension, I absorbed it. If something felt off, I smoothed it over internally. I learned how to make discomfort disappear, at least on the surface. And because I did it so well, no one thought to ask what it cost me. Even I didn't ask that question for a long time. From the outside, my life looked unremarkable in the best way. A solid marriage, a healthy child, a home that ran on routine. There was nothing dramatic enough to justify dissatisfaction, and that made my quiet unease feel illegitimate. So I minimized it. I became the woman people leaned on, confided in, relied upon, without ever considering that I might also be keeping a private ledger of moments that didn't quite add up. I wasn't collecting evidence back then. I was collecting impressions, fragments, small inconsistencies I didn't yet know how to name. And because I never reacted strongly, people assumed nothing ever truly affected me. That assumption would later become their blind spot. At that stage of my life, I still believed invisibility was a form of safety. If I stayed pleasant, stayed composed, stayed useful, nothing would explode. Nothing would be taken from me. I didn't realize that invisibility doesn't protect you. It just delays the moment when you realize how much has already been taken. Back then, I thought my role was to hold things together. I didn't yet understand that roles can be assigned without your consent, and that the most dangerous ones are the roles that make you disappear while everyone else feels secure. The first time something cut me, it didn't feel sharp. That's important, because if it had been obvious or loud, I might have reacted differently. I might have said something. I might have drawn a line before the pattern had a chance to form. But this wasn't like that. It was subtle enough to pass as nothing, small enough that everyone else missed it completely. It happened on an ordinary evening. No raised voices, no accusations, just a casual shift in plans that I found out about after the fact. He told me he'd be working late, again. I remember nodding, already adjusting dinner in my head, already thinking about bath time and bedtime stories. It wasn't until much later, scrolling absently on my phone, that I saw the photo. A mutual acquaintance had posted it. A group shot. A dinner table I didn't recognize. Wine glasses, laughter. He was there. Not working, not late, just elsewhere. When I asked him about it, I didn't accuse, I didn't confront. I said his name lightly and mentioned the photo as if it were an afterthought. I gave him space to explain himself because that's what reasonable people do. He laughed. Not cruelly, not defensively. Just a soft, dismissive laugh. Oh, that was nothing, last-minute thing. I didn't think it was worth mentioning. Not worth mentioning. Those words stayed with me longer than the explanation itself, because what they really meant was that my awareness wasn't necessary, that my inclusion in the truth was optional, that he got to decide what I needed to know. I remember feeling a flicker of something then, discomfort maybe, a tightening in my chest that I smoothed over almost immediately. I told myself I was being sensitive, that couples don't need to report every detail of their day, that trust meant not interrogating harmless omissions. Everyone else seemed to agree with that logic. When I mentioned it casually to a friend, she shrugged. Men are like that, she said. If it wasn't a big deal, it wasn't a big deal. So I filed it away. That's how the first cut worked. It didn't bleed. It didn't scar right away. It simply introduced the idea that my understanding of our shared reality was flexible, negotiable, something that could be adjusted without consulting me. I started noticing how easily that adjustment happened. Plans changed without discussion. Information arrived late, incomplete, or not at all. And every time I questioned it, the response was the same. Light, reassuring, slightly amused, as if the very act of asking was an overreaction. You worry too much. You're reading into it. It's not that deep. What made it effective was how calm he stayed while saying those things. There was no anger to push against, no hostility to justify my discomfort. Just a gentle insistence that I was imagining complexity where none existed. So I did what I'd always done. I adapted. I told myself that marriages have rhythms, that this was just a phase, that focusing on small inconsistencies was a waste of emotional energy. I convinced myself that letting things go was a sign of emotional intelligence. But something had shifted. I didn't trust my own dismissal of the moment. I didn't feel resolved. I felt unfinished, like I'd closed a book without reading the last page. The discomfort didn't grow louder. It grew quieter. It settled into the background of my thoughts, persistent but unobtrusive. And because it didn't disrupt daily life, no one noticed it. Not even me, most of the time. Except I began to remember details with more precision: times, dates, expressions. Not because I was suspicious, but because I was unsettled. My mind was trying to restore coherence where it sensed a fracture. That night, I wrote nothing down. I took no screenshots. I gathered no proof. All I did was register the cut. And for the first time, I didn't immediately forget it. That, in hindsight, was the beginning. After the first cut, nothing dramatic happened. That's how normalization works. There's no announcement, no clear moment where you can say, this is where things went wrong. Life continues at the same pace, with the same routines, the same shared jokes, the same responsibilities. And because the structure remains intact, you assume the foundation must be solid. I told myself that trust meant flexibility, that long-term relationships require a certain tolerance for ambiguity. I repeated those ideas until they sounded like wisdom instead of self-silencing. Small dismissals became background noise. A message left unanswered for hours, then waved away with, "I didn't see it." A story retold later with details that didn't quite match what I remembered. A decision made and justified after the fact, always framed as efficiency, never exclusion. Each incident on its own was forgettable. Together, they formed a pattern that only one of us seemed to notice. I became very good at rationalizing. I told myself I was lucky. Lucky to have stability. Lucky to have a partner who didn't yell, didn't disappear for days, didn't create chaos. I compared my situation to worse ones and used that comparison to keep myself quiet. That's how disrespect survives. It hides behind gratitude. The more I adapted, the more my adaptability was expected. If I asked a question, it was treated as an inconvenience. If I expressed discomfort, it was reframed as insecurity. The underlying message was consistent and subtle. You are safe as long as you don't complicate things. So I didn't. Instead, I started editing myself. I chose my words carefully. I waited for the right moment to bring things up, moments that never quite arrived. I learned which topics triggered defensiveness and quietly removed them from the conversation. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was slowly being trained, not intentionally perhaps, but effectively. Every time I swallowed a concern to keep the peace, the boundaries shifted. Every time I accepted an explanation that didn't sit right, I taught him and myself that my intuition was negotiable, that my need for clarity was optional. And because I was calm about it, because I never made a scene, the dynamic looked healthy from the outside. Friends admired our communication. Family praised our balance. No one saw the quiet imbalance that was growing. Not even me, at least not consciously. But my body noticed. I slept lighter. I replayed conversations after they ended. I found myself paying attention to tone more than content, to timing more than words. My awareness sharpened, not because I was suspicious, but because something in me refused to fully settle. I still didn't think of it as disrespect. That word felt too strong, too accusatory. I told myself this was just adulthood, complex, imperfect, full of compromises. I believed that loving someone meant making allowances for their blind spots. What I didn't ask was why those blind spots always seemed to align with my discomfort. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, when I considered pushing back, when I imagined saying, that hurt or that doesn't make sense. But each time I weighed the potential outcome. Would it change anything? Or would it just introduce tension I'd then be responsible for managing? So I chose quiet. And quiet, repeated often enough, becomes habit. The turning point wasn't a discovery or a confession. It was a realization that crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly. I was working harder to maintain harmony than anyone else in the room. I was expending emotional labor to preserve a version of peace that required me to stay slightly off balance. Still, I stayed. I stayed because leaving felt disproportionate, because naming the problem felt like an overreaction, because I believed that if I just stayed patient, clarity would arrive on its own. But clarity doesn't arrive where it isn't invited. Instead, what arrived was normalization. The slow acceptance of being slightly diminished, slightly dismissed, slightly out of sync with my own perceptions. Not enough to justify action, just enough to erode confidence. And that erosion was quiet enough that no one thought to stop it. No one, except the part of me that was still watching, still remembering, still waiting. It took me longer than I like to admit to realize that I wasn't just adapting to circumstances. I was performing a role. No one ever sat me down and told me what that role was. It emerged naturally, the way expectations always do, through repetition, through praise when I stayed within the lines, through subtle discomfort when I didn't. I was the reasonable one, the one who understood, the one who didn't overreact, the one who could be counted on to smooth things out when schedules clashed or moods shifted. In conversations, my job was to contextualize, to soften, to translate friction into something more palatable. If my husband was distant, it was stress. If plans changed, it was efficiency. If I felt uneasy, it was anxiety. Everyone seemed comfortable with these explanations, including me, most of the time. What made the role so effective was that it came with validation. People admired my composure. They trusted my judgment. They said things like, "You're so grounded," or, "I don't know how you stay so calm." Calm became my currency. And like any currency, once others rely on it, they expect it to remain stable. The moment I stepped even slightly outside that role, by asking a question too directly, by pressing for clarity instead of accepting reassurance, I felt the shift. The air changed. The conversation tightened. Not with anger, but with disappointment. "This isn't like you." That phrase carried more weight than any accusation. It implied a deviation, a mistake, as if my value were tied to my predictability. So I corrected the course. I learned where my edges were supposed to be and kept them carefully filed down. I became efficient with my emotions, expressing only the ones that could be resolved quickly. Confusion was allowed briefly, frustration sparingly, anger not really. Anger would have disrupted the role. The irony is that the more invisible my needs became, the more indispensable my function seemed. The household ran smoothly. The emotional temperature stayed even. From the outside, everything looked balanced. Inside, I felt increasingly compartmentalized. There was the version of me who operated the system, logistics, parenting, appearances. And then there was the quieter version who noticed how rarely decisions were made with me instead of for me, how often my understanding was assumed rather than earned. I didn't think of myself as powerless. I just thought this was the trade-off for stability, that someone had to absorb uncertainty so others could feel secure. What I didn't see yet was that roles like this are only stable as long as the person playing them agrees to remain static. And I was changing, not outwardly, not in ways anyone else could measure. But internally, I was becoming aware of the cost, of how much energy it took to maintain an image of effortlessness, of how often I swallowed questions that deserved answers. I began to notice how little space there was for my curiosity, how quickly conversations were redirected when I lingered on details, how often I was reassured instead of informed. Reassurance, I learned, is not the same as respect. Still, I didn't confront anyone about this realization. I didn't announce it. I simply observed it the way I'd observed everything else, quietly, patiently. At that point, I still believed that if I fulfilled the role well enough, it would eventually be reciprocated. That reliability would be met with transparency, that my steadiness would inspire honesty. I didn't yet understand that roles assigned without consent rarely evolve in your favor. I was reliable, useful, invisible in exactly the ways that benefited everyone else. And for the first time, I started to wonder what would happen if I stopped playing that part. The day something shifted wasn't marked by discovery. There was no message uncovered, no confession overheard, no evidence laid bare. In fact, if you looked at that day from the outside, it would have seemed almost boring, ordinary, the kind of day that disappears into the blur of routine. But internally it was seismic. It happened in the quietest moment, one of those pauses that exist between tasks, when there's no one watching and nothing demanding your attention. I was sitting at the kitchen table after dropping my child off at school, my coffee untouched, the house unusually still. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't rushing to fix anything. I was just present. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced. Not emotional, not dramatic, just clear. If I don't understand my own life, that's not peace. The simplicity of it startled me. I realized that I had been mistaking calm for clarity, that I had been soothing myself with explanations instead of seeking the truth, and that the constant low-level confusion I lived with wasn't a personality flaw, it was a signal. That moment didn't come with anger, it came with focus. I replayed conversations in my head, not to judge them, but to listen to them as if they belonged to someone else. I paid attention to what was said and what wasn't, to how often my questions were answered with tone instead of information, how often reassurance replaced transparency. And suddenly the pattern sharpened. I saw how often I had been asked to trust without being allowed to verify, how frequently my intuition had been treated as something to manage rather than respect, how subtly the narrative had shifted from partnership to accommodation. What changed that day wasn't my behavior, it was my orientation. I stopped asking, "Am I overthinking this?" I started asking, "What do I actually know?" That question didn't provoke fear, it provoked curiosity. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. I wasn't ready to name betrayal or even dishonesty, but I was ready to stop anesthetizing my own awareness. So I did something radical for me. I paused. I didn't bring anything up. I didn't test reactions. I didn't look for reassurance. I simply observed my life as it was, without editing it into something more comfortable. And what I observed was inconsistency, not just in stories or schedules, but in accountability, in who was expected to explain themselves and who wasn't, in whose discomfort mattered and whose was reframed. That day, I understood something quietly but firmly. The version of me that kept everything running was no longer willing to run on confusion. There was grief in that realization. Not for the marriage as it was, but for the version of myself who believed that understanding would eventually be offered without being requested. I didn't feel strong, I didn't feel empowered, I felt sober. And sobriety, I learned, is far more dangerous to fragile dynamics than anger ever could be. From that point on, silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I chose, not out of fear, out of intention. I didn't announce this shift, I didn't explain it. On the surface, nothing changed. I still smiled, still participated, still fulfilled my responsibilities. But internally, I had stopped filling in the gaps with assumptions. I let the gaps remain, and in those gaps, truth had space to move. That was the day I stopped trying to make things make sense and started letting them reveal themselves. Once silence became a choice, it changed its texture. Before, my quiet had been reactive, a way to avoid conflict, to keep things smooth. Now, it was deliberate. I wasn't withholding out of resentment or fear. I was creating space, space to see clearly, space to stop managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own understanding. What surprised me was how quickly that silence was misread. Because I didn't ask questions, it was assumed there were none. Because I didn't push, it was assumed everything was fine. Because I stayed calm, it was assumed I was unaware. That assumption worked in my favor. I stopped volunteering explanations for my moods. I stopped smoothing over inconsistencies for others. If something didn't make sense, I didn't rush to resolve the tension. I let it sit. I let conversations end unfinished. And in those unfinished spaces, people revealed more than they realized. Details emerged casually, unguarded. Timelines slipped. Stories shifted slightly from one telling to the next. Not enough to trigger an alarm, just enough to create a trail. I wasn't collecting evidence yet. I was collecting contrast. The difference between what was said and what was done. Between what was promised and what materialized. Between the image of reliability and the reality of avoidance. What made this phase powerful was how unremarkable it looked. There were no secret passwords, no hidden devices, no dramatic late-night searches. I went about my days as usual. School drop-offs, work emails, dinners, bedtime routines. On the surface, I was exactly who I had always been. Internally, I was adjusting my attention. I listened without filling in gaps. I noticed without reacting. I stopped explaining away things that felt off just to maintain internal harmony. That alone changed everything. Silence gave other people room to talk. When you stop asking clarifying questions, people assume they're being understood. They relax. They simplify. They stop editing. I noticed how often my husband spoke in generalities when specifics were warranted. How easily he leaned on my past tendency to accept summaries instead of details. He didn't realize that my acceptance had shifted from trust to observation. And because there was no confrontation, no accusation, no visible tension, there was no reason for him to become more careful. This wasn't manipulation, it was patience. I wasn't trying to catch him in anything. I was trying to understand the reality I was living in, without the filters I had previously applied. At the same time, I began quietly strengthening parts of myself that had been neglected. I reconnected with professional skills I'd put on hold. I organized documents. I made sure I understood our finances. Not in a suspicious way, but in a responsible one. None of this raised alarms. It looked like maturity, like competence, like the same dependable woman everyone trusted. The difference was that I was no longer using that competence to absorb confusion. I was using it to reduce it. There were moments when I felt the urge to speak, to name what I was seeing, to ask for reassurance, to restore the old rhythm. But I resisted that urge, not out of cruelty, but out of respect for myself. I needed facts, not comfort. Silence allowed facts to surface naturally. And with each passing week, my internal picture became clearer. Not more dramatic, just more coherent. I didn't feel angry. I felt increasingly calm, in a different way than before. A grounded calm. The kind that comes from alignment rather than suppression. Others mistook it for disengagement. They thought I was tired, or content, or simply busy. They didn't realize that silence, once chosen, can be a form of presence more intense than words. And they had no idea that this quiet was not the absence of action, but the beginning of preparation. What they never noticed was how methodical I became, because from the outside, nothing about me suggested preparation. I didn't withdraw socially, I didn't become cold, I didn't start asking suspicious questions or guarding my phone. I was still present, still functional, still reliable. That familiarity was my camouflage. Preparation, when done quietly, looks like normal life. It began with structure, not secrecy, structure. I started organizing things I had always handled loosely before. Calendars that had once lived only in my head were now written down. Expenses I'd previously glanced at were logged. Conversations that once drifted by were now anchored to dates and contexts. At first, I told myself I was just being responsible. A parent should know these things. A partner should understand the framework of their shared life. That was true, but it was also incomplete. What I was really doing was restoring alignment between reality and record. I noticed how often information existed only verbally, how few things were documented, how much trust is placed on memory instead of confirmation. That realization didn't alarm me, it clarified me. So I began documenting my life. Not his, not ours, mine. I kept track of schedules, when he said he'd be home, when he wasn't. Not with commentary, just timestamps. I noted childcare responsibilities I handled alone. Not with resentment, just facts. I saved messages that included plans or explanations, not to reread them obsessively, but to establish continuity. What surprised me was how little effort this took once I stopped resisting it emotionally. I wasn't driven by suspicion, I was driven by coherence. If something didn't make sense, I didn't rush to resolve it internally. I simply recorded it and moved on. Over time, those fragments began to connect on their own. I also started paying attention to what wasn't said. When conversations skipped details, when answers were vague, where precision would have been natural, when explanations changed slightly depending on the audience. These weren't dramatic shifts, just subtle inconsistencies that only stood out because I was no longer smoothing them over. I didn't challenge them, I let them accumulate. At the same time, I strengthened my independence in ways that looked innocuous. I updated my resume, I reactivated professional contacts, I explored flexible work options, not as an escape plan, but as a safeguard. It felt responsible, not rebellious. No one questioned it. In fact, people praised it. "Good for you," they said. "It's nice to see you doing something for yourself." They didn't realize how intentional that something was. I also began consulting quietly, not with friends who would ask questions, but with professionals who dealt in hypotheticals. I asked general questions. I learned how systems worked, custody, documentation, and financial disclosure. I didn't present my situation. I presented scenarios. I learned what mattered and what didn't. Emotion didn't matter. Timing did. Consistency did. Records did. That knowledge didn't frighten me. It steadied me. What they never noticed was how little drama accompanied this phase. There were no secret folders labeled ominously. No whispered phone calls, no rehearsed speeches. Just a woman returning to precision. The more precise I became, the calmer I felt. Because precision removes ambiguity, and ambiguity had been the most exhausting part of my life. I stopped speculating. I stopped asking why and focused on what. What was happening? What was observable? What was verifiable? And once I shifted to that mode, the truth didn't need to be chased. It surfaced, not all at once, not explosively, but steadily, like a picture coming into focus pixel by pixel. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. That clarity didn't make me cruel. It made me careful. Careful with my words, careful with my reactions, careful with my timing. Because I understood something fundamental now. The person who remains calm while others assume stability holds an advantage that rarely gets noticed until it's too late. They thought my silence meant nothing was happening. What they never noticed was that everything was. The truth didn't arrive with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where my hands shook or my heart raced. No cinematic pause where everything went quiet. When the final piece settled into place, what I felt was recognition. Like seeing a word clearly after sounding it out for a long time. I already knew. I just hadn't allowed myself to say it yet. The reveal happened privately, in a way that felt almost anticlimactic. It wasn't a confrontation or a discovery that required courage. It was a confirmation, one that came from aligning what I had documented with what I had long sensed. Dates matched patterns. Explanations overlapped in ways they shouldn't have. Absences formed a rhythm. When I laid everything out, not emotionally but structurally, the picture became undeniable. There was an affair, not a single reckless mistake, not a moment of confusion, but an ongoing choice that required planning, deception, and the quiet assumption that I would continue to fill in the gaps. I didn't cry when I realized this. That surprised me. I felt a deep, steady sadness. Not for him, but for the version of myself who had been working so hard to make sense of half-truths. I grieved the energy I'd spent translating inconsistencies into something tolerable, the trust I'd extended without reciprocity. But there was no rage, because rage requires shock. And I was no longer shocked by reality. I was aligned with it. What struck me most in that moment was how calm my thinking became. There was no urge to confront, no desire to expose, no fantasy of vindication, just a quiet understanding that the situation now had a name, and that names change how you move. I didn't tell anyone. Not friends, not family, not even myself out loud. I let the knowledge settle without dramatizing it. I resisted the urge to seek validation or comfort. Not because I didn't need support, but because I needed clarity more. I understood something crucial then. Once spoken, truth invites reaction, and reaction creates noise. I wasn't ready for noise. Instead, I asked myself a single question. What does my child need most right now? The answer was immediate and unwavering. Stability, safety, a future not built on confusion. That question became my compass. Everything else, anger, disappointment, grief, was secondary, not unimportant, just not decisive. I looked at my life with fresh eyes. The household, the routines, the agreements that had been assumed rather than honored. I saw how much of the emotional labor I carried alone, how much continuity depended on my presence. And I saw something else too, leverage, not in a manipulative sense, in a structural one. I understood how the system worked now. I knew what mattered in legal contexts and what didn't. I knew which patterns spoke louder than explanations, which facts carried weight regardless of emotion. And I knew that my calm, so often mistaken for passivity, would be interpreted very differently once the truth entered formal spaces. That realization didn't make me smile. It made me still. I took a breath and allowed myself to fully accept what I knew, not as a story, not as a betrayal narrative, but as information. Information changes options, and options are powerful. I also accepted something else that night, sitting alone in the quiet of a house that suddenly felt less shared than I'd believed. The marriage I thought I was protecting no longer existed in the form I'd been preserving. Grieving that didn't require confrontation. It required honesty with myself. So I closed my notebook. I shut down my laptop. I went to bed at my usual time. I read a bedtime story. I kissed my child goodnight. Nothing on the outside changed. But internally, a line had been crossed. From that moment on, I was no longer trying to understand what was happening. I understood. Now the only question left was what I would do with that understanding. And that decision, unlike everything before it, could not be made passively. Once you know the truth, indecision becomes a form of action. That was the realization that followed me in the days after the private reveal. I moved through my routines as usual, meals, school runs, work, but everything felt slightly sharpened, not heavier, clearer. I understood now that doing nothing was no longer neutral. There were multiple paths available to me. I saw them distinctly, like doors in a quiet hallway. One door led to confrontation. I could have laid everything out, demanded explanations, forced a reckoning. That path promised emotional release, maybe even remorse, but it also promised chaos, raised voices, instability, and the very thing my child did not need. Another door led to endurance. I could have stayed, armed with knowledge, and allowed the arrangement to continue in silence. Many people do this. They call it pragmatism. They tell themselves it's for the children. But I knew that path would require me to shrink again, to carry the weight alone while appearances remained intact. There was also a door marked exposure. I could have told friends, family, anyone who would listen. I could have reframed the story before he had a chance to. But that door was loud, and loud doors attract opinions, pressure, and narratives that spiral beyond your control. And then there was the final door, the one that didn't promise catharsis or applause, the one that required patience, precision, and restraint. I chose the irreversible one, not because it felt good, but because it aligned with my values. I decided to act in a way that prioritized outcomes over optics, that protected my child over my pride, that respected truth without weaponizing it. That decision didn't happen all at once. It settled gradually, like a weight finding its balance. I tested it internally, turning it over, examining its implications. Once I accepted it, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: certainty. The path forward would require silence, but not submission. Movement, but not announcement. It would require me to be meticulous, not emotional, patient, not passive. I accepted that this meant delaying confrontation. That meant allowing him to believe the status quo remained intact. That meant living alongside someone who did not realize the ground beneath him had shifted. That wasn't easy, but it was clean. I set a personal rule for myself: no actions driven by anger, and no decisions made without documentation. Every step would be reversible in planning, but decisive in execution. I also accepted that I would be misunderstood in the short term, that people might later ask why I hadn't said something sooner, that they might interpret my calm as complicity. I made peace with that, because I knew something they didn't yet know. Timing matters more than truth in systems designed to evaluate responsibility. I wasn't waiting out of fear. I was positioning. And once I named that, the guilt dissolved. I wasn't deceiving anyone. I was simply choosing when and where truth would do the least harm and the most good. And the hardest part of this decision was letting go of the fantasy that honesty alone would fix things. If I just told the truth, everything would be resolved fairly. Reality doesn't work that way. Systems don't reward sincerity. They respond to structure. So I committed to structure. I committed to moving carefully, quietly, and legally, letting facts speak instead of emotions, to ensure that when the truth entered the room, it would not be dismissed or diluted. This wasn't about winning. It was about not losing what mattered most. Once that decision was made, I stopped feeling torn. The anxiety that had followed me for months began to lift, not because the situation improved, but because my direction was set. From that moment on, every action had context, every silence had purpose, and the path ahead, though demanding, was no longer uncertain. Once the decision was made, movement didn't look like motion. It looked like normalcy. That's the part people misunderstand when they imagine planning. They picture urgency, late nights, frantic energy, visible tension. What actually followed was the opposite. My days became quieter, more routine, more controlled. Because when you move in silence, you don't rush. I began aligning my life with the future I had chosen, one practical step at a time. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise questions. I scheduled consultations during hours that blended easily into my existing routine. I gathered documents that should have already been organized and made sure they were complete. I verified information rather than assuming it. I learned the difference between what felt fair and what could be proven. And I kept my emotions out of it. That was intentional. Emotion blurs memory. It invites reinterpretation. I needed my records to be boring, clear, factual, unassailable. Dates, times, responsibilities, financial flows, parenting patterns. I didn't editorialize. I didn't annotate with feelings. I let the consistency speak. At home, I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance that would signal a shift. I continued to participate in family life as I always had, not out of deception, but out of continuity. Continuity mattered. It demonstrated stability, reliability, presence, all the things that would later be questioned without justification. What struck me during this period was how invisible preparation is to people who believe they control the narrative. My husband assumed that because nothing had changed emotionally, nothing had changed structurally. He mistook calm for complacency. He mistook routine for reassurance. He didn't notice that I had stopped asking for updates, that I no longer needed explanations, that I had quietly stepped out of the role of interpreter and into the role of observer. I also stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own absence. If he missed a commitment, I documented it. If I adjusted my schedule to compensate, I noted that too. Not with frustration, just accuracy. Accuracy became my discipline. There were moments when this felt surreal. Sitting at dinner, listening to familiar conversations, knowing that the ground beneath them was no longer solid, knowing that I was already living in the after, even though no one else had caught up yet. But I didn't feel deceitful. I felt resolved, because I wasn't pretending that nothing was wrong. I was choosing not to introduce chaos before I was ready to contain it. I also prepared my child's world quietly, not with warnings or explanations, but with consistency. Bedtime stayed the same, school routine stayed intact, joy remained present. That mattered more to me than any sense of justice in the moment. Moving in silence required restraint, but it also offered something unexpected: dignity. I didn't have to argue for my reality. I didn't have to prove my pain. I didn't have to perform heartbreak to be taken seriously later. I simply had to remain steady. As weeks passed, the foundation I was building became solid enough to stand on its own. I could see the structure clearly now, what would happen when and why. And still no one noticed. Not friends, not family, not the man sharing my home. They saw the same woman they'd always seen: calm, capable, reliable. They didn't realize that reliability, once redirected inward, becomes independence. By the time the first external step was taken, quiet, procedural, inevitable, I was ready, because silence had done its work. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with speeches or dramatic reveals. Most of the time they enter quietly, feel before they're understood. That's how it began for him, and for everyone else. Small disruptions appeared first. Schedules tightened. Flexibility disappeared. Things that had once been absorbed without comment now required adjustment. Not confrontation, just absence. The safety net he hadn't realized existed was no longer catching everything. He noticed it as an inconvenience. A meeting he assumed I'd rearrange around didn't move. A childcare gap he'd never accounted for became visible. A missed commitment wasn't smoothed over. It simply stood there, unresolved. At first he was confused, then mildly irritated. "What's going on?" he asked one evening, not accusing, just unsettled. "You seem different." I smiled and told him I was just busy, which was true. Busy no longer meant covering. It meant handling my own priorities. He didn't push. People rarely do when they sense a shift they don't yet understand. They wait, hoping it will correct itself. But it didn't. Over time, the effects spread outward. Friends noticed changes in availability. Family dynamics adjusted subtly. I stopped being the automatic point of coordination. Not deliberately, just practically. And because I didn't explain the change, people filled in the gaps themselves. Some assumed I was tired. Others thought I was focusing on work. No one suspected the strategy. Why would they? I had never given them reason to. What became clear to me during this phase was how much of the household's functionality had rested on my quiet interventions. How many things ran smoothly because I anticipated problems before they surfaced. Once I stopped doing that, the system began to reveal its weaknesses. Not catastrophically, just enough to be noticed. My husband began asking more questions. Not about us, about logistics, about timing, about responsibilities he'd never tracked before. There was a subtle edge of anxiety beneath his curiosity. He didn't know what he was feeling yet. He just knew that something reliable was no longer compensating for his absence. I remained calm, consistent, kind even. But I didn't overextend. I let natural limits exist. The consequences weren't punitive. They were structural. They emerged not because I demanded anything, but because I stopped preventing reality from asserting itself. And reality has weight. There were moments when I felt the urge to explain, to soften the discomfort, to reassure him that nothing was wrong. Old habits don't disappear easily. But I reminded myself discomfort is not harm. Confusion is not cruelty. Letting someone feel the effects of their own choices is not the same as attacking them. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations grew more tentative. Plans were checked twice. He started paying attention in ways he hadn't before. Too late. What struck me most was how this phase didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought me distance, not emotional withdrawal, clarity. I could see the dynamic now, without being inside it. I understood how much of the relationship's stability had depended on my willingness to overfunction. And once that willingness was gone, the imbalance became undeniable. Still, I said nothing, because the purpose of this phase wasn't revelation, it was alignment. By the time the legal process began to move, quietly, procedurally, the consequences had already prepared the ground. The story people would later tell themselves had already begun to shift. Not because I controlled it, but because I stopped controlling everything else. And in that vacuum, truth started doing its own work. By the time panic arrived, it was already behind schedule. It didn't come as an explosion. It crept in through questions that were a little too frequent, reassurances that felt suddenly urgent, gestures that arrived without context. He began paying attention in a way that felt unfamiliar. Not attentive, but alert. Something was wrong, he just didn't know what. He tried to restore the old rhythm first. More presence at home, more offers to help, casual suggestions of trips, dinners, and resets. The language of repair, used without acknowledgement of damage. If I had wanted reassurance, this would have been the moment to accept it. But reassurance was no longer the currency. I could see now how repair attempts that come without accountability are really about restoring comfort, not trust. They're meant to stop the feeling, not address the cause. He sensed the distance, but misdiagnosed it. "You've been quiet lately," he said one night carefully. "Did I do something?" The question hung between us. It wasn't sincere curiosity. It was fear of consequences he couldn't yet name. I told him I was tired, which was true, in a different way than he understood. He searched for the version of me he knew, the one who would explain, contextualize, make sense of the moment. But that version of me no longer existed. And because I didn't confront him, he couldn't confess. That's the paradox people don't expect. When you remove chaos, you also remove the stage for apology. There was no fight to interrupt with remorse, no accusation to deflect, just a calm, immovable distance that offered no cues. He started second-guessing himself. He asked questions that circled the truth without touching it. He offered transparency in fragments, hoping I would signal what I knew, but I didn't. I wasn't testing him. I was done managing outcomes. The more he tried to fix the atmosphere without understanding the foundation, the more unsteady he became. His tone shifted from confident to cautious, from casual to concerned, and still no truth. That was when I knew it was too late. Not because the affair couldn't be confessed, but because integrity, once bypassed repeatedly, can't be retrofitted. You can't install honesty after the structure has been built on omission. The systems I had quietly set in motion were already moving forward. Deadlines were approaching, documents were filed, professionals were aligned. There was no dramatic point of no return, just a series of completed steps. He felt the pressure without seeing the mechanism, and pressure without clarity creates panic. He tried to anchor himself in the past. "We've been through worse," he said once, reaching for familiarity. "We always figure things out." I listened, and I realized something quietly devastating. We had never figured things out. I had figured them out. He had benefited from that labor without noticing it was labor at all. This time there would be no invisible hand smoothing the edges. When the formal notice finally arrived, not as an emotional declaration, but as a procedural reality, his confusion turned into disbelief. He looked at me as if I had changed suddenly, as if this had come out of nowhere, and I understood in that moment how deeply he had underestimated the distance between comfort and consent, between silence and agreement, between calm and compliance. He wanted to talk, to explain, to rewind, but there was nothing to rewind to. The version of the marriage he was trying to save existed only because I had been holding it together without truth. Once that effort stopped, there was no structure left to reinforce. This wasn't punishment. It was a consequence. And consequences don't negotiate once they're in motion. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was quieter than anyone would expect. No raised voices, no accusations stacked like evidence on a table, no emotional monologues demanding acknowledgement, just facts, placed carefully, respectfully, and without urgency. By the time we sat down to speak openly, the outcome was no longer theoretical. The process had begun. The structure was in place. What remained was not persuasion, but acknowledgement. He was nervous. I could see it in the way he avoided direct eye contact at first, in how he tried to control the tone by keeping things casual. He expected anger, or grief, or something he could respond to. What he found instead was calm. I didn't ask him why. I told him what. I explained that I knew about the affair. Not in detail, not with dates or names. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require elaboration anymore. I stated it as information, already processed, already integrated. He froze. Not because he was surprised, but because he realized there was no opening to argue, no narrative to correct, no emotional escalation he could redirect. He tried briefly to explain, to frame it as confusion, stress, or a lapse in judgment. I listened without interruption. Not out of forgiveness, but out of completeness. I wanted the conversation to end without loose ends. When he finished, I thanked him for being honest. That caught him off guard. Honesty, delivered too late, doesn't restore trust, but it does close a chapter cleanly. I told him that my priority had always been our child's stability, that I had chosen to move carefully and legally, not emotionally, because chaos would have harmed the one person who didn't choose any of this. I didn't accuse him of cruelty. I told him that the decisions he made required me to make my own. He asked why I hadn't said something sooner. I answered simply, because I needed clarity, not reassurance. That was the moment he understood. Not everything, but enough. He saw that my silence hadn't been confusion. It had been resolved. That I hadn't been waiting for an explanation. I had been preparing for an outcome. There was regret then, real regret. Not for being caught, but for being underestimated. For assuming that calm meant unawareness, that patience meant tolerance. I didn't correct him. Some realizations need to land without commentary. The conversation ended without hostility. We discussed logistics, boundaries, next steps. There were moments of sadness, yes, but no collapse, no emotional bargaining. The absence of drama made everything unmistakably final. When we stood up from the table, nothing dramatic marked the end, but something irreversible had been acknowledged. I didn't feel victorious. I felt intact. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying an emotional load that required constant adjustment. I wasn't translating reality into something softer. I wasn't protecting someone else from the consequences of their own choices. I was simply standing in truth, without needing it to hurt anyone to be valid. That was the power of a confrontation without heat. I am not the woman I was when this story began, but I am also not hardened by it. That's important to say because people often expect transformation to look like armor, sharp edges, emotional distance, a visible refusal to trust again. What changed in me wasn't my capacity for care. It was my relationship with clarity. I no longer confuse calm with consent. I understand now that being agreeable is not the same as being aligned, and that silence, when chosen intentionally, is not weakness. It's discernment. I still value peace, but not the kind that requires me to disappear to maintain it. My life now is quieter in a different way. There is less explaining, less compensating, less anticipating what others need before they ask. I don't overfunction to keep systems stable anymore. I let structures reveal themselves as they are. And in doing that, I've found a steadiness that doesn't depend on anyone else's behavior. Motherhood looks different too. Not because my child was shielded from truth, but because they were anchored in consistency. The home they experience now isn't perfect, but it's honest. There's a rhythm to our days that doesn't require vigilance to maintain. I don't perform resilience for them. I model it. Professionally, I return to parts of myself I'd set aside. Skills I'd kept dormant are now active again, not as a reaction to loss, but as a reconnection to autonomy. I make decisions without apologizing for their impact. I consider outcomes without minimizing my role in them. What surprises people most is that I don't speak bitterly about the past, not because it didn't matter, but because bitterness keeps you in conversation with what no longer deserves your attention. I've already said what needed to be said, in the only language that counted. I learned that dignity is quiet, that power doesn't need an audience, and that the most lasting shifts often happen without spectacle. I am still observant, still reflective, still calm, but now those traits serve me first. I ask direct questions. I expect clear answers. I trust my instincts without demanding they be validated by anyone else. When something doesn't make sense, I don't rush to explain it away. I pause. That pause has become my compass. This experience didn't teach me to distrust people. It taught me to trust myself, to listen when confusion arises instead of silencing it, to treat patterns as information, not inconveniences, to understand that love without honesty is not protection, it's erosion. I don't regret the way I handled things, not because it was easy, but because it was aligned. And alignment, I've learned, is what makes walking away feel like moving forward. There's a moment after everything is done, after the decisions are made, the papers are signed, the story settles into its new shape, when you realize what this was really about. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about being right, and it certainly wasn't about punishment. It was about refusing to live inside confusion. For a long time, I thought strength meant endurance, that being good meant being flexible, that love meant absorbing discomfort so others could remain comfortable. Those beliefs didn't make me noble. They made me easy to underestimate. What changed my life wasn't anger or exposure. It was clarity. Clarity has a way of stripping away illusions without making a sound. It doesn't demand. It doesn't argue. It simply reorganizes your priorities until the path forward becomes obvious. I didn't document the truth to hurt anyone. I did it to protect a child who deserves stability without deception, to protect a future that didn't require constant emotional translation, to protect myself from becoming someone who explains away their own reality just to keep the peace. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-respect expressed through action. The hardest part of this journey wasn't discovering the betrayal. It was letting go of the fantasy that honesty would be offered if I waited long enough. Some truths only arrive when you stop asking for them and start preparing for them. If there's one moral I want to leave you with, it's this. Silence is not the opposite of strength. Silence without awareness is. When silence is chosen, when it's paired with observation, documentation, and intention, it becomes a form of authorship. You stop reacting to the story you're given and start writing the one you need. You don't owe anyone chaos to justify your clarity. You don't owe anyone access to your process. And you don't owe anyone your confusion. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in parts of it, if you felt that quiet dissonance, that sense that something isn't adding up but you've been telling yourself it's fine, I hope this story gives you permission to pause. Not to confront, not to accuse, but to look, to trust that your awareness isn't a flaw, that patience doesn't require self-erasure, and that walking away with dignity is sometimes the most powerful resolution available. So I'll end where I began, with a question, not a directive. Have you ever stayed quiet long enough to realize you weren't powerless, just underestimated? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.